Hi, this is Benoy Thanjan, your host of the Solar Maverick Podcast. Today's episode is a special one. It's a replay of my recent interview on the What Matters podcast, powered by PVcase, one of the leading software platforms helping developers streamline site selection, design, and feasibility analysis for solar projects. In this conversation with host Ana Conde, we dig into one of the most make or break stages in any solar project, site selection and feasibility. I share insights from my 20 years in renewables, including how I founded Renew Energy, what makes or breaks a site, the financial and interconnection challenges developers face, and how AI and automation tools like PVcase are transforming how projects are developed. It's a practical, real world discussion about how to make a solar project from concept to completion. Big thanks to Ana and the What Matters team and PVcase for having me on their show. You can find a link to the original episode on the What Matters podcast in the show notes for the Solar Maverick podcast. Let's get into it. Solar only makes 5 to 6% of total generation in the US. I would say in 10 to 15 years, maybe 20 years, probably be 50 or 60%. So there's such a massive opportunity with site selection and finding good sites. And the more challenging sites are going to work because we're going to see power prices increase substantially. Hello and welcome to the Solar Maverick Podcast, where solar meets entrepreneurship and experience. I'm your host, Benoy Thanjan, so let's get into it.
In today's episode, we're digging into one of the biggest make or break moments in any solar project, site selection and feasibility. It's the stage where projects either get the green light or never get off the ground. To walk us through the real-world challenges and opportunities, I'm joined by Benoy Thanjan, founder and CEO of Renew Energy. Benoy has seen it all from financing, permitting, interconnection to land acquisition, and he even has advised solar startups, giving him a uniquely complete picture of how projects succeed or fail. Benoy, I'm so glad to have you on the show. Welcome. Can you tell us about your professional journey and how you got started in the renewable energy sector?
Yeah, definitely. I appreciate you having me on the podcast and being one of the first interviews. So I've been now in the renewable energy sector. I can't believe it. It's been more than 20 years. Time flies by when you're having fun. It's amazing to see the growth of the industry. I first got into energy actually out of grad school. I worked at Deloitte and Touche in their energy financial advisory services practice. And then I wanted to be on the buy side or the investment side instead of the consulting side. So I worked for a private equity fund called Ridgewood Renewable Power, and I analyzed investments in renewable energy projects, not solar. I can't believe it's now going to be like 17 years ago. I was like, solar is going to be the next big thing. I was telling everyone about it. People are like, you're crazy, you're out of your mind. And I'm like, I have to work for a solar company. So I actually worked for a company called Vanguard Energy Partners, which is a large EPC doing project finance. And then I worked at Tesla in their project finance group. I started their environmental commodities trading desk. Then 13 years ago, I started Renew Energy. We're a solar developer and consulting firm, mostly focused on developing solar projects in the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic of the US, predominantly New York and New Jersey. We're also doing stuff in California and Texas as well. And I've developed over 100 megawatts of solar projects in the US, and things are always constantly changing. And we're learning as we go and adapting and adjusting to new market dynamic, which makes it fun.
I always love hearing how people getting to, find their way into clean energy. And it's normally not a straight line, but for you, I think it seems like it was pretty clear. And the one thing I didn't mention during the intro is that Benoy is also the host of the Solar Maverick Podcast. So tell us, Benoy, how did you get started and what was the goal of the podcast?
It's been an amazing journey. I started the Solar Maverick Podcast in 2018. We've released 240 episodes. We come out with content on a weekly basis, and I'm excited to interview Anne on the podcast at RE Plus, which is coming out in a few weeks. So it was interesting. I was actually on a podcast called Create Your Life. The host, Kevin Y. Brown, he and I were in an accelerator together at different points. It's called the Startup Leadership Program, which is an entrepreneurship accelerator. I started Renew Energy at the same time as that accelerator. Anyway, I told him I would be a great guest. I was so confident, and I love podcasts. I listen to a lot of podcasts. And then he said, sure, let's have you on the podcast. So I did the interview, and my marketing person was like, wow, like this is a great interview. Like, how long did you prepare for it? And I said that Kevin gave me the questions like a minute beforehand. And then it was like this 45-minute to an hour interview. So he's like, oh, we should look if there's any solar podcasts. Let's try to do this podcast. And, worst case scenario, like you'll get a lot better at public speaking. We've interviewed so many great guests like Jigger Shaw, who was head of the DOE's loan program, Abby Hopper recently, who's the head of the Solar Energy Industry Association. It's about solar and entrepreneurship. So we talk about that and provide suggestions. It's amazing like how podcasting can help educate the industry. And I appreciate Solar Maverick Podcast. You can find it on all the major podcasting platforms.
Oh, yeah. We invite all of our audiences to go and check out the Solar Maverick. And thanks, Benoy. We're excited about launching our podcast too.
I'm excited for you.
So tell us, why solar? What was it that out of all of the renewables, solar was the one that you had your mindset on?
Yeah, so I had first experience in fossil fuels at Deloitte. So I had experience with coal, gas, simple cycle, combined cycle, distribution, heating networks, transmission, distribution, transition to Ridgewood, renewable power. And I did waste to energy, landfill gas, hydro, biomass, which is wood burning. But the great thing about solar, and when I studied it, is solar is a technology, not a fuel. And we have an abundant resource of solar every day. The sun shines, and we're not even capturing. There must be a percentage out there of how much actual solar we're using for used renewable energy. So what I liked is a technology, not a fuel. I saw back then that it's going to be the cheapest energy source in the future, and it's very easy to build. And, I have experience with developing a waste energy facility, solar and wind, and solar is definitely a lot easier to build. And with storage becoming economical, the big thing is an intermittent fuel source. That really changes the equation. And also it's distributed power. So it's, our old energy model was you have a big plant, it generates the power, then it goes through transmission and distribution to get to the home or the business. But now you could do it localized and on site, which obviously is a lot better and also creates independence as well from the grid, which a lot of companies and residential homes want to be. So that's kind of how it happened. Also, too, I believe with the electricity transition that we're seeing, like there'll be less dependence on gas and fuels. And, the US has been in a lot of wars due to oil in the Middle East. And so the electrification of the grid is a great way to not be dependent on foreign oil.
Great points there. I'd love to hear how you decided, or the moment when you decided to go from working within the industry to actually starting your own company. What led you to the creation of Renew?
Yeah, so I always wanted to start my own company. Both my parents actually had their own businesses. So from the age of 12, I worked at both of my parents' business. My mom was a pediatrician. She had her own practice in the Bronx, New York. Then my dad was an electrical engineer, and then he started his own business maybe like 20, 25 years after working in engineering. He had a lighting company that sold light bulbs, ballasts, and fixtures to small business corporations. So I always knew I wanted to be an entrepreneur. I didn't know exactly what it was going to be. And then I knew eventually once I was in solar that it was going to be something in solar. I think what really kind of helped me was when I was at Tesla / Solar City. I worked for Lyndon Rive, who was the CEO of Solar City. He's actually Elon's cousin. And then I realized they were actually listening to a lot of what I was saying and implementing it when it came to environmental commodities. And I told myself, I really should start a business on this. I always planned to be an entrepreneur. I think once I was at Tesla, had the confidence. And, I basically talked to them about, doing the same stuff that I was doing with environmental commodities, but instead as part of Renew Energy. And Tesla was my first client, which was great to start a company and then have a big client like Tesla, I was at that point managing one of the largest environmental portfolios in the country. So I think that really helped having two parents who are entrepreneurs because it's definitely not easy to do. And then to understand the lifestyle that you would get into, and then the confidence to start it when I was at Tesla, and then them being the first client that I had, which was always grateful. And I learned so much from working at Tesla too that I've incorporated in my own business. So.
Really interesting how you just grew up with it. And then as soon as solar clicked, you just knew that that was the path. And, you were at a really good place to build that experience and then help you then set up from there. Okay, so let's dive into today's topic, which is site selection and feasibility. This is really where projects either get their wings or never get off the ground. So maybe let's think about the big picture. And so when you think about site selection and feasibility, what's your general approach?
I mean, our general approach is obviously finding, relatively flat site without a lot of trees that's close to three-phase power. We do a lot of community solar development. So we're trying to look for projects that are less than a mile from the interconnection point or three-phase power. We also look at like how many megawatts are available to tie into the grid. Those are like the main things. Obviously, this is even before we talk to the landowner, and then we're trying to figure out, how challenging maybe permitting might be in that township, if there's sort of endangered species as well beforehand. So we're trying to due diligence the land site as much as possible. And then obviously, like, we high level have created like a financial model to know like where to target. We create basically like a 20 to 25 year like discounted cash flow model because we know that's what investors are looking for. And then we basically try to model it out like they would be doing, like what are the revenue assumptions, the EPC, the interconnection cost plays a huge part of it. I wish it was just like, hey, there's land. It's funny because I feel like a lot of developers just find a great land site and then they don't do all this other work that's necessary to finalize whether it's a good site or not. So we're trying to do as much due diligence before we actually reach out to the landowner, because all that takes time and money too, so we want to make sure that it's a good site before we're actually contacting the landowner.
Yes, and I know that you've seen projects from so many different angles over the years, so this is really helpful. So let's dig a little bit deeper. What would you say would be the top things that you check for? You've mentioned them a little bit, but if you had to just enumerate, then like which ones would be the ones that you normally go for when you're sizing up a site's potential?
As time goes on, it's harder to find good sites. It's more challenging, especially in sites like, for example, we developed a lot in New York State, and now New York is actually a very like saturated market. So it's actually harder to find good land sites because all the good ones are kind of taken. So you have to look at sites that maybe aren't as ideal as what we initially looked for. I think the other thing too, I didn't mention previously, was we prefer to go to markets where you could co-locate on the same site. So really what that means is, like, for example, for community solar, the maximum system size usually is like 5 megawatts AC. But it really depends on the state, but most states in the US, that's the limitation on the size. But we'll try to find a site where we could put maybe 2 or 3 community solar projects. It's not that easy to do, obviously you have to do permitting and things like that. So I think we try to find sites where there's minimal site work. So where I was talking about like, hey, if there's trees or if it's sloped, I mean, we prefer relatively, flat sites. Obviously, I go back to this, like an endangered species is like a huge thing. So that's something we look at. And also too, if the township's pro solar, what we've seen in certain markets, like there'll be solar moratoriums that townships put because they've been inundated by so many solar developers for the land. So we try to find sites where there hasn't been a solar moratorium because already the development timelines now take so much longer than they used to. And time is money. So we're trying to be very efficient with doing as much due diligence at site selection so that we don't have come up with these issues later. And it can be very costly if you don't try to due diligence everything as early as possible.
That frames the issue in a really helpful way. And then sometimes, a site looks great at first glance, but then it's really not the case. And you already mentioned like endangered species, but what would be some of the other red flags that might come up at a first look that might give you an idea that site is not as strong as you think?
once we find a site that we think is good, like we'll reach out to the landowner first through like a mail campaign, then call the landowner. And then to walk the site, we learn a lot actually. I mean, obviously with technology now, obviously PVcase is in the forefront of this, finding, substations and design but actually walking the site, we learn so much. And then talking to the landowner too, we learn about the site. And maybe there are things that we weren't able to find, with our own research. But when we talk directly to the landowner, they'll provide some information on the land specifically. And, maybe there's some things we didn't even think about. We're educating the landowner and then we're trying to provide them a fair lease rate of what we think it's worth, which is different. Maybe other developers we find to be a lot more aggressive. They haven't fully modeled out the project, where we want to really be transparent with the landowner as much as possible. We also like being, if we're targeting a certain location, like just being involved with the township and then knowing and try to build those relationships, because then we also learn too, like what were challenges from other sites that might have been in that same area or utility. And it's the same thing too. We're trying to build a relationship with the utility because they sometimes will provide us actually, like we'll tell them about a site and they'll know information that's not publicly available as well. That could be like challenging related to interconnection or how much like sometimes like an upgrade could be. So we know like maybe it's not even worth our time. So we're trying to minimize our cost from the beginning.
And then I guess when things, after you've done all these visits, when things don't check out, I assume the financial side usually makes it clear. So what would be, for example, one of financial deal breaker that has killed projects in your experience?
Obviously, the interconnection is like the biggest cost. So sometimes when we've applied for preliminary interconnection that we get the, final cost of what it would cost, that kills a lot of projects. I think sometimes it's challenging too with the townships. This was what I was getting to, is like pilot taxes. That's basically property taxes for the solar project. And sometimes like the townships don't have realistic expectations of what they should charge in taxes. And these are not like real estate projects, which is a lot more lucrative. It's a solar project. I mean, they're obviously, they want tax revenue, but sometimes like the projects can't support it. So we try to educate the township too if we think like they're asking too much, but sometimes like the township's not flexible. So that's another, thing that could kill the projects. Also too, like there's obviously right now a lot of uncertainty. We don't know what the real EPC cost is, how much of the ITC. So also federal legislation's making it tariffs. Like now is a little bit challenging when we talk about like projects outside of 2026 because we're waiting for guidance for foreign entities concern, which is related to China and the investment tax credit. So that all this uncertainty basically makes a challenge. I would say it's extremely challenging, at least right now, to develop solar projects, especially when you talk about earlier stage, just because there's so much uncertainty. But obviously there are companies that are more equipped to handle the uncertainty, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's really a very clear way to frame it. And then I was thinking also on the flip side, there's sometimes really challenging sites that can be turned around. So maybe do you have a particular story of a complex site that you were able to make work?
Oh, there's so many stories. I'm trying to figure out which one. I mean, I think the most complicated project is actually like the rooftop solar project that we're doing for the New York Housing Authority in Harlem. So we're doing it on 35 rooftops. That's going to be the first community solar project in Manhattan. I mean, I think like the challenging thing with that was just like figuring out good rooftops that don't need much roof replacement and restoration. Also, you're talking about multiple small sites. And then to get like an investor interested in that. And then obviously you're going through a public entity to lease their roof to educate them and getting comfortable with it. So, I mean, I think a lot of it was education and like just going on sites multiple times. The New York Housing Authority is one of the largest real estate owners in New York City in the 5 boroughs.
You're talking about all of these challenges, finding right roofs or the right land and finding, the least amount of work. From all of your experience throughout these years, what are some innovations or tools that you've seen recently that make site selection and feasibility decisions a little bit smarter or faster?
Well, I think, like software and AI and automation is a huge thing. I know PVcase obviously integrates these things to make site selection a lot easier and find good sites. The challenging thing is other developers are able to use those tools as well. So it makes it more competitive. But I think like AI and automation, and it's amazing like how much software is now out there to basically use, and then design too is like getting automated. I mean, we contract all our engineering out, so we don't have like engineer in house, but to see like now designs and have become like automated or AI generated is pretty amazing to see. So I think it's a lot easier to like just even contacting the landowner, like land campaigns and, sending things out and like the GIS technology and enablement and then being responsive, very quickly and automating like a proposal process or, agreements and things like that. I mean, for a small company, I think we lean probably more on software and innovations maybe than some other developers out there.
Sounds like you're very familiar with the new trends and the new softwares out there. But of course, every trend ends up living up to a hype. So are there any trends that maybe are a little too overhyped right now you can think of?
I think at the end of the day, like you can have all this technology, but if you can't build relationships, you'll see it's a lot harder to develop and obviously to create projects. So obviously it's great to have these tools and everything and it makes you smarter, but there's still like the human aspect of it that's so important and people like doing business with people that they know, like, and trust.
Exactly. I think we can move to doing things smarter and faster, but that human connection we really can't get rid of because in the end is how you build trust with your community, your customers, and everyone around you. On the flip side, would you say that there's any trend or anything that maybe we're not paying enough attention to that you think, I guess, your competitors should know about?
First of all, like I would say, we don't believe we have It's really like us being adding value to our clients, and the better that we get, the better we're able to serve and add value to the clients. And in the solar industry, it's still early, and there's so much opportunity in so many different ways. I would say like this is a trend that everyone's obviously talking about is adding solar and storage to projects, which everyone's looking at, or storage only. It's a lot more complicated to add storage. And then it's complicated too for the finance and community to basically invest in these projects. So, I mean, that's a differentiator that we have. Like my background is in finance. So, a lot of developers know how to find a good site and they don't know how to do other stuff. Obviously, us having like a diverse team and then as well as me, I've worked in different parts of the solar and energy industry. So I'm able to bring a unique perspective. I mean, we first actually, which is interesting, like we were doing renewable energy credits that we're helping developers with finding financing for projects. And then developers were asking us like, hey, can you help out with this, this, and this? So we started providing development as a service. And then we started developing our own projects. So like, we've worked with a lot of developers and we see what works and what doesn't work. So, everyone's obviously looking at storage only, solar plus storage, especially with the big beautiful bill, is basically extending the investment tax credit for standalone storage in the US till I think it's 2033 at the full 30%. So we believe like obviously you're going to see a lot of storage. It's just extremely complicated. And we believe like it's a lot more complicated than solar. And we believe like a lot of developers are not going to be able to compete because it'll be too complicated. More complicated than solar development already has been. But we think there's going to be a great opportunity for sure.
So with all this competition and, as the competition for land heats up, what would you say is your strategy for finding viable sites and as things get a little bit tighter and more competitive?
So it's basically going to places that there's now not a lot of competition, states and geographies that are not as competitive. So this is the other thing that makes development challenging. As I kind of alluded to it before, development is local. The people developing the most projects, really from the development standpoint, are the people who are in those markets. So we're going to continue to focus on New Jersey and New York, even though they're I guess, saturated compared to other markets. We are looking at other markets as well, but I would say too, like we're also partnering with developers that we know who are maybe in those markets or someone local to that area is kind of how we're going to differentiate ourselves. So like staying on our existing markets because there's still opportunities. The other thing too, I mentioned solar plus storage, but also we're seeing a lot of repowering of assets. If your audience is not familiar with repowering, it's basically taking older solar, plants and then replacing them with newer, like obviously modules, but also potentially storage. And it's a lot easier to get approved because it's already been, approved for interconnection and other things. And that's kind of what we're focused on, like, I guess, staying local to our existing markets and then going to markets that are less competitive, but having a local partner.
And then I'm sure we have a lot of listeners who are starting out in this space. What would be the one piece of advice that you would give someone who's assessing their very first site?
So I think the first thing to do is first get into like a letter of intent. Look high level on Google Earth, see if it looks like a good site. Try to find the person who owns the site, but also make sure, like, ideally, like a half a mile or less from the three-phase power. Try to figure out whether there's an opportunity to interconnect. And then obviously the landowner piece is like, find the contact information of the landowner, figure out what the market is for that piece of land. Usually most developers are going into lease agreements. They're not purchasing the land. So like obviously coming up with the market value, what you think is viable, and then model out the project to see if it's viable. I mean, that's the challenging thing. Like developers are not modeling projects in the beginning to see, if it works. And that's kind of a waste of time.
That's a really good, valuable guidance. So let me close with this. And you may have already touched on some of these items, but what's the North Star for you? So let's talk about the guiding principle that you always come back to when you're looking at a potential solar opportunity.
I mean, it's really about long-term value and trust, right? So we're so transparent. We'll tell people the site sucks to the landowner. Like, it doesn't make sense to do solar, or it's better for you to wait. This is what we know right now, but it's probably all going to change.
Yeah, and I'm sure your customers value that approach. And it really should be the approach we take in solar. It's the way to keep pushing solar forward. So based on everything we discussed today, what would you say are the main takeaways for our listeners when it comes to the future of site selection and feasibility?
Well, first of all, there's so much opportunity, right? Like, I know I'm saying it's saturated or competitive now, but it really actually isn't. I'm comparing it from 5 years ago. But think about how many rooftops, right, in the US don't have solar on it. Even commercial rooftops and even land on planes all the time flying over the US. And I'm still surprised, like, how much solar there is not. So, like, this is very early in the process of site selection. And obviously it's like using tools, like PVcase has amazing tools to help find ideal site. The solar transition is still very early. And I think I've just been in it for like now 15 years or more than 15 years. It's still early. Like 50% of all new generation last year was solar in the US. And that's going to continue to increase. And I think solar only makes 5 to 6% of total generation in the US. I would say in 10 to 15 years, maybe 20 years, probably be 50 or 60%. So like there's such a massive opportunity with site selection and finding good sites. And the more challenging sites are going to work because we're going to see power prices increase substantially. So remember, like I was saying, like, oh, well, the economics don't work. So I'll even tell this to landowners, like, the economics don't work right now, but give it 2 or 3 years and it'll make sense because like electricity prices are going to increase dramatically. Solar is going to continue to go down in pricing because it's a technology, not a fuel. I didn't mention this, but Swanson's law is basically similar to chip computing with Moore's law, that basically if you double the production of solar, panels, the module will go down like 50%. We'll continue to see that. So it's exciting. Like it's still very early. Like I've been so early in the solar or energy transition that I have to remember that it's still very early and the opportunity is going to be a lot bigger and a lot more exponential than the past 5 to 10 years.
It's really, really great hearing you speak with so much optimism and so much excitement. But I'm sure we have some people in the audience who are a little bit more concerned right now with the One Beautiful Bill and how this will be affecting, solar moving forward, the solar coaster, as it's being called. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously it's very challenging. A lot has happened in a very short period of time. July 4th was the signing of the Big Beautiful Bill. I think it's going to be extremely challenging the next year and a half for a lot of companies, especially in construction and development of solar projects. Like, for example, for us, just to be transparent, any of earlier stage projects other than the existing 80 megawatts that are close to NTP, we're basically telling the landowners and building owners, we're going to have to wait. We're not going to do anything because we don't really know. And this is for 2026. And I've heard there's a lot of discussion within the government. So I don't even know when they're going to figure this out. But I would say it's definitely going to be a very challenging time for sure. A lot of companies are going to go bankrupt. We're already seeing large companies going bankrupt. I'm hearing companies obviously laying off, people are not hiring. And I think you're going to hear more of this happen too as the year goes on. One thing is the solar industry is pretty dynamic, resilient, and pretty creative. You will see a lot of innovation. Obviously, we're already seeing electricity prices go up a lot, and they'll go up even more, which is exciting to me because this is a byproduct of what happens when the federal government's basically limiting the fastest form of electricity be able to come onto the grid. So obviously it's going to be a challenging time for everyone, but I think I've now been on the solar coaster with my own company for 13 years. So I'm pretty confident, whatever the government does, we'll figure out a way to the industry will come up with a way with an innovative solution, and we can't control all these other dynamics. But I think part of the industry is excited, hey, these projects, we might not even need federal incentives, like the investment tax credit. If electricity prices keep going up like this, obviously the oil and gas industry has supposedly given $1 billion to the current administration in lobbying dollars. So obviously, they have to do what's beneficial for them. And, unfortunately, the customer is going to pay with higher electricity prices. But that also does help, obviously, the solar industry, because what I keep reiterating, it's the cheapest form of electricity, the fastest to go online, because everything else just confuses the customer. That's all I tell customers, because people are telling them a million different things. And there's also a lot of fake news. Main thing is that solar is the cheapest form of electricity and the fastest to come online.
That's definitely the key takeaway. But Benoy, thank you so much for joining us today and walking us through the realities of site selection and feasibility. It's really been a really practical and eye-opening conversation. And for everyone who wants to keep up with Benoy's work, definitely check out Renew Energy and connect with him on LinkedIn. And don't forget to check out his Solar Maverick podcast. And to our listeners, I hope you're walking away with some real-world takeaways you can apply in your own projects. Thank you, Benoy.
Thank you, Ana. Thanks for listening to the Solar Maverick Podcast. The Solar Maverick Podcast is brought to you by Renew Energy. We're a solar development and consulting firm. If you believe that this podcast is adding value to you, please give us a 5-star review and share with those that you think could benefit from this information. Please email all questions, suggestions, and feedback to info@renewenergy.com. That's info@reneuenergy.com. The Solar Maverick Podcast is produced by Podcast Laundry and executive produced by Benoy Thanjan and Kevin Y. Brown.